alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm Tim Niederreiter, and with me today is my latest guest, Lew Bayer. Welcome to the show.
Hello there.
So, as I understand it, you write nonfiction. What kind of nonfiction do you write?
Well, I write about civility, so it's about how to be a better person and make change in the world, but based on a competency that we call civility.
Okay. So, what is this competency? Geez, I can say words. What does this competency, civility kind of entail as far as people in general?
All right, so civility is this way of making other people feel valued in the world. Some people call it human-kindness, but it's about ethics. It's about choices, about people treatment and so on. But there's 4 underpinning competencies. They are, 4 skills that underpin the competency. They are social intelligence, cultural competence, systems thinking, and continuous learning.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Honestly, when I approach this, I just would say personally, when I approach the character traits kind of stuff, the different aspects of how you take apart an ability or a trait of a person, because I do that sometimes. I take that from the game perspective, either because I'm doing a role-playing game or something like that, or I take it from the creating a fictional character perspective. And so it's kind of an interesting difference, obviously, because you're studying real people, and I'm making up fictional people and trying to make them seem as real as possible, that kind of thing.
Right. But I suspect real for you when you're making your characters real, it's though that fictional character's persona is based on some semblance of reality, right? So some experience with actual behavior, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's, even though I write science fiction and fantasy, it's really actually because I write science fiction and fantasy, it's especially important that my characters come off as real. And lately I've been doing better about that. But anyway, I've been getting some decent reviews lately, and people seem to like the characters in these recent books. But yeah, what's your work? Do you have a book out yet? What's that called?
I have several books out, but the one I was hoping to talk about today is called The 30% Solution. And it's about how civility at work increases retention, engagement, and profitability. And it's grounded in some pretty meaty and significant research in the field that shows that organizations that engage in civil behavior as part of their code of conduct, for example, values, policies, processes, and so on, experience on average 30% more profit.
Okay. So you're taking it from kind of a more capitalist-driven perspective in some ways.
That's right. I mean, sad but true. We've been at it for 20 years, and we started out doing children's, courtesy camp and teaching kids table manners. And, very quickly you discover that the same kids are coming back year after year. And, the reality is children have to have some example to follow. And, if you look at politics, you look at how adults behave in sports and online, in the media and so on, we can see that we're sorely lacking in leadership and civil discourse. And so, we shifted away now, and we focus really on adults. But adults will pay, $40 without blinking for a pizza, and it's gone in 10 minutes. But they seem to hesitate to spend $40 on a book that could potentially change their worldview, or spend $40 on a class that could help them be a better communicator or earn the respect of their peers and so on. So we've had to resort to this research that, really proves the business case that, it pays to be polite, civility is good business, and that there's some a profitable side to it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess that makes sense to me. I mean, because if you're going to take it from the angle of this is just what's right, that's a statement that doesn't exactly enthuse people from a more materialistic worldview, right? I mean, if you're saying like you should just be civil because it's the right thing to do, which is an argument people can make and often do make, it doesn't have that kind of compelling drive to it. So I can see why you're going from that angle.
Right. And I think, there's a whole school of, sort of, we can say do-gooders or, the good cop and the hero and, people who really embrace humanity and kindness for the sake of kindness and generosity and peacekeeping and so on, just for the sake of it. And, more and more I see that there are, more people kind of living their values that way. But the reality is, most of us spend a great deal of time at work, employers and business and money talks, and kind of a lot of decisions are grounded in that. And so if we can get employers on board and teach them that making a healthy workplace environment that is safe, that is respectful, will actually make you money. Everybody benefits, right? They make more profit, but the employees are happy. They go home happy. They're kinder to their families. They do good in the community. They don't kick the dog. It's this big positive thing happens. So in my mind, if we have to go at it from, as you say, a capitalist kind of, approach, and if that works and gets the job done and makes the positive change, then that's what I'm going to do.
That makes sense to me. I just noted that you mentioned the profit motive there, which is a good way to encourage organizations, especially which are mostly driven by the profit motive, to go for this kind of thing.
That's right.
And then as you described, it kind of trickles down. As it trickle down to the line of smaller and smaller until you get, he doesn't kick the dog. The employees don't kick their dogs when they get home. Yeah, so it makes sense. So as far as methods, does this book go into the kind of ways to teach people to be more civil, or is it more of research?
Oh, no, both. So, I mean, we had to provide all the research so that people understand that it's a real thing. We're not just sitting in the car making it up. But there are, very strategic, practical training plans and processes and things that we can employ. So it's everything from teaching people to be present, and to be able to read nonverbal and contextual cues. For example, you sound like you're younger than me, but, I grew up eating dinner 7 days a week around the dinner table with no television on. And I learned pretty quickly that when my father raised his eyebrow ever so slightly, that meant something. These days, in spite of how good animation might be or whatever, we find a younger generation especially is not tuned in. They're not correctly interpreting, body language and eye contact and tone of voice, or reading between the lines and, what isn't said in an email and so on. And we call it social intelligence, but it's sorely lacking. And especially in an age when we have, research says 120 different cultures who all have their own set of customs and cues in every workplace, you have to be present to pick up on some of that, or there's a lot of room for miscommunication.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm probably a little younger than you, a few years younger, let's say. But I did grow up. I was actually born in 1990. I can say that now because I'm almost 30.
In 1990.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm getting there, getting on toward 30. But anyway, but even though I did actually grow up with a situation kind of similar to yours, in that my parents and the whole family, all 7 of us, would sit down around the dinner table, and there would be no TV on most days for dinner. But regardless, that's probably an outlier. So I see where you're coming from there. I know, most of the people the kids I knew when I was little did not have that situation. Mm-hmm. So I also would want to add that I think for in purposes of this discussion, it's interesting you mentioned social intelligence, because I was diagnosed as autism spectrum disorder when I was a kid. Actually, Asperger's syndrome, but now that's kind of been folded into autism spectrum disorder. And that social intelligence is one of the big things that's lacking. One of the big qualities that autistic people tend to lack, especially as children. And I don't know. I think it's fascinating to me that can affect people so much. I mean, it does affect people a great deal, and it can change your life completely if you say misread an email and you miss the hidden meaning or the meaning that's like
Right,
between the
right.
lines, you know?
So what's fascinating about that, and I agree with you that increasingly we're seeing a larger number of children diagnosed with Asperger's and social. I say deficit, but not in a derogatory way, but some of
Mhm.
those lower social intelligence issues and social radar, which I believe is what you're referencing in terms of inability to read cues to the
Yeah.
same extent as someone who isn't diagnosed that way is just one part of social IQ. And the research suggests that Asperger's, for example, some of those children actually score higher on other elements of social intelligence. So while their ability to not read visual cues might be lower, their ability to comprehend written and unwritten rules is sometimes higher. Their ability to read and adapt social style is sometimes higher. There's a range of aspects. It's quite a complex endeavor actually to build that overall skill. But those of us who may not have been diagnosed Asperger's certainly have an advantage, I would say. Um, and sadly, though, we don't use it to the extent that we should. And if you marry that up with cultural competence, which incorporates our ability to restrain, to practice non-judgment, and to take accountability for ourselves and others, the fact that somebody might have some physical disability or been diagnosed with something, any kind of mental or physical or psychological, even psychosocial issue, we should actually be able to overcome that quite easily just by fostering civility component of non-judgment, meaning that we don't assume that there's a deficit there, right? It's the same as any other sort of unconscious bias.
Mm. Okay, so by non-judgment, what do you mean?
I mean that we don't go into scenarios making assumptions about women or gender
Mm.
or the fact that somebody has been labeled Asperger's doesn't diminish his or her ability. It should not automatically in our mind diminish an ability to do any number of things, right? There's all of these through the labeling of it. It's just like calling someone a bully. All of these conscious and unconscious bias that ensue and cause all sorts of problems from a civility point of view. It's the same as assuming that an immigrant can't speak English or can't
Mm.
read, or all of these sort of assumptions we make is completely contrary to cultural competence. And so, from a civility point of view, we're trying to teach people to be systems thinkers, to assume the best of people. I should have warned you I could go on for 3 days, but I think the bottom line is many people assume that civility is just manners. It's Martha Stewart perfection.
Mm.
It's Emily Post niceness, and that's actually about 5% of what civility is. It's quite a broad and complex competency.
Okay, so civility encompasses a lot more than just your dinner table manners, your, which fork you eat with, that kind of nonsense. Probably that's a very minor part of it, in fact.
Absolutely. And in fact, I would argue that in the big scheme of things, I don't care what fork you use, and you can eat your steak with your hands. I'll still invite you to dinner. But what's important is that you make me feel valuable, accepted and respected in your company. And that's the challenge we face these days amidst technology, rapid change, diversity, all of these things is we've lost our ability to connect, this kind of social fabric, what some experts refer to as social capital. We don't value each other just as human beings the same way we used to.
Interesting, because I agree that there's definitely an issue there. I mean, we definitely have this issue of values, but what's your research show about people valuing each other more in the past? Is that affected perhaps by technological growth or just the modern age in other ways?
Sure. I mean, there's different ways that that we identify different indicators by which we can make that statement. So one, for example, is reliance. 50 years ago, I couldn't just pick up the phone and call somebody to deliver some food because somebody was sick or there's an emergency or the car doesn't go or whatever. I would have to rely on the kindness of a stranger who maybe had to walk 4 miles, down the road to get to me, to check on me. I had to rely on people in a different way. We have a stronger reliance, the research shows, on technology than on individuals, for the most part. And it depends which factor we're looking at. For some emotional needs, of course, the indicators vary. But when we talk about physical and social needs, many people are quite content never actually seeing a person for 3 or 4 days at a time, provided they're not without their devices. That's a very different scenario from 30 years ago.
That's a very good point. I was curious, but that definitely speaks to me. I especially, because I actually kind of live as not quite a shut-in. I do live in a house with other people, but I don't have much reason to go outside the house because I work from home. Unless I'm going somewhere for a particular reason, or just to walk around. I'm not gonna see other people unless I make an attempt to go see them and make some effort. And so that is way different. Yeah.
Yeah, you could choose whether or not you want to seek them out, but you could live quite happily with whatever technology and not engage in direct human contact for quite a lengthy period, right?
Oh, I suppose potentially. If I really didn't want the human contact, I could. But I'm kind of an extrovert as well. I don't see I get very uncomfortable if I'm just in my own head for too long, despite being an author and working from home and all this stuff. I spend more time by myself than with other people, but I do really cherish the time I spend with other people.
Right. And the word, what you just said there, cherish, this is an element of civility as well, because the opposite of what I've just been discussing is people who actively seek out human contact, but the quality of it is missing. So you say cherish, that suggests to me that there's a quality, there's a quality about those interactions, that it's not just kind of just to be in the room with people, that there's some engagement involved. And we see from the research that the nature of engagement is different. We can have a conversation with someone now face to face without ever looking them in the eye. And that's considered appropriate social interaction in some environments. You don't have to have physical contact as in a handshake, where previously that was considered an element that was required. Those kind of things. So the nature of the interaction has also changed.
Well, that makes sense. I know. I mean, and it's for some reason. I mean, maybe it's a little too personal, but for a long time, I went through life with people just assuming, oh, he's one of these people who doesn't like, he doesn't touch other people. He doesn't like handshakes or hugs or any of that stuff. And I don't know why how I projected that attitude, but I suppose I must have, because for a long time, people I knew pretty well were like, no, we're just gonna, like, they'd shake hands with everyone else and they'd avoid me, kind of thing. And they'd just say, well, you don't want that, that kind of thing. And it is kind of strange when because in this case, they were actually misreading me, I think. But it's one of those things that I realized affected me in a way, because now I'm like, okay, so people are going to treat me a little differently now, and possibly because of my diagnosis, or just because of whatever I projected.
So I'm interested in that. Would most of these people have known, like, would they have labeled you as Asperger? Would they have known that about you? Or was it purely on their reading something about your demeanor?
I think it probably was largely demeanor. I mean, this was back when I was an older teenager for the most part. And I was a pretty surly teen. I mean, most teens are unpleasant in their own way. They're teenagers have hormones, they have issues. But I've got to say, I think it might have been something on top of that. And I know, at least in the case, that the most prominent case I was thinking about, I was like, yeah, that was a teacher who probably did know I was on the spectrum. But most people did not necessarily, though I've always been pretty open about it.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah, anyway, that's So what civility sounds like to me is actually the way you're describing it. It sounds a lot like just how I kind of think of it, what I kind of think of as kindness or generosity, just in general terms.
Right, and there's nothing wrong with that assumption. I mean, certainly kindness is part of it, but I would also say that when you really get into learning about civility, you come to understand that sometimes being civil means that you are necessarily perceived as unkind. So sometimes it's that sort of like cruel to be kind, or sometimes there's that's aspects of social justice come into play there, where they might say something like, it's not such a good idea just to drop food on an impoverished community and have them rely on that food, and then when the food goes away, they're left starving. A more civil thing would be to give them the resources and support them growing their own food. Those kind of aspects of civility in terms of a worldview and systems thinking, that comes into play as well. But kindness, of course, that's an undercurrent.
Well, that makes sense. It's very much pardon their religious interpretation here, but the Buddhist interpretation of kindness plus wisdom, that's the two things that you need the most. So in wisdoms, you set them free of you by teaching them to grow their own food in that example, rather than just making them dependent on you by giving them food, and that kind of gives you power over them, and that's not exactly the same thing as being outrightly helpful.
Right.
It's not that was what you say civil, the way in your terms.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Yeah. So I think if you had one thing you wanted to impart quickly about your book, what would you say to people if you just want to impart a little something, to hook people and make them want to see what you've done here?
Well, I mean, I guess the one thing I try to help people understand corporate, mostly corporate, because my focus is workplace, is that, it's okay to want to make money. There's no shame in wanting to be profitable. You are business oriented, but why not consider how you can also improve the quality of life, that you can improve a community, that you can offer all sorts of benefits in the course of making that money, and potentially make more money if you approach it from a civility point of view than if you're just making money without considering the impact of that. So, I mean, it's really a win-win, and I think frequently people just assume that there has to be a people cost when you are profit oriented, and I don't find that that's necessarily true.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of The Prisoner's Dilemma, I think. Or
I don't know that.
I think that's the one where, maybe I'm mistaken, but there's this game kind of thing where there are these two prisoners, and they can either lie about each other or not when they're being questioned, right? Let me see if I can remember this one off the top of my head. I think I do. I've read this one a few times. It's a kind of classic thought experiment, where if the prisoners, neither of them tells on each other, they'll both be equally, treated or whatever, and they'll be treated pretty reasonably, let's say. And then if one of them lies about the other and tells them and says that the other one doesn't lie, then they both get then the one who does get treated, who lies, the one who gets lied about gets treated far worse, right? And the one who, and then, but if they both lie, that's the question. Then they're both treated worse, because then neither of the stories are going to agree, right?
Oh, I see. Isn't that interesting?
And it just reminds me of the real solution is that they should both tell the truth, basically, or they should both tell the same story. So whatever that is, it's obviously, this is a theoretical situation here.
Right.
And in this little game, if both people do what's best for the other person, they'll end up total better off. It's kind of the same sort of thing. That's a very theoretical, obviously abstract kind of way of thinking about it, though.
Right.
Anyway, is there anything else you want to add about your book? Because we're running a little low on time now.
Oh, no, thank you. No, I appreciate your time.
All right. Where can people find your book, and who should check it out, I suppose?
Oh, thank you. The book is on Amazon, and HR business consultants, business owners would find it useful. And we're civilityexperts.com.
Thank you for being on the show. And
thank you.
It's been good. Also,
Good.
if you want to find more about this podcast, you can go to mentalcellarpublications.com. That's all fiction, not nonfiction. So if you're listening to this show for our stellar guest this week, well, you may not be interested in this stuff, but on the other hand, you may be, because people like stories. I have a feeling. And I also have a new book that's up for pre-order right now. That's called Demon Scroll, and that's the first book in my new epic fantasy series. So check that out on Amazon. You can get it for the pre-order price of 99 cents right now. So check it out, and thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good week.
That tears it.